All right. So this is chapter 21. So we've kind of finished, this is the end of the cardiovascular system. We talked about the blood in chapter 19. We talked about the heart in chapter 20. Now we're going to talk about the blood vessels themselves, okay? And so when we talk about arteries, arteries carry blood away from the heart. So it doesn't matter if it's carrying deoxygenated blood or oxygenated blood. It's just always, arteries are always carrying blood away from the heart, okay? And then veins are always carrying blood back to the heart. Again, it doesn't matter if it's oxygenated or deoxygenated. It's always carrying blood back to the heart. So when we look at the pulmonary system, the pulmonary arteries carry blood away from the heart and to the lungs. So do you think those arteries would have oxygenated or deoxygenated blood? Deoxygenated. They'd be deoxygenated, so those arteries would be blue. Okay? And then the pulmonary veins are carrying blood back to the heart from the lungs. What do you think they are going to carry? Oxygenated, because that's what they picked up in the lungs. So those veins are going to be red. All the other arteries and veins in the body are going to be the exact opposite. Okay? So the aorta carries blood away from the heart. That's a big artery, right? And it's carrying blood away from the heart. Is it going to carry oxygenated or deoxygenated blood? Oxygenated, because it's taking the blood to all the tissues in the body. And then the superior vena cava are bringing blood, their veins, large veins, are going to bring blood back to the heart, right? So is that going to be oxygenated or deoxygenated? Deoxygenated. It's bringing blood from the tissues. It dropped off the oxygen in the tissues and is bringing it back. All right. So we look at the differences between arteries and veins. Anatomically, there is a difference. In the artery and in the vein, they both have the same 3 layers. And the layers we call tunica. Okay, so we have the outermost layer of both the arteries and the veins. That's called the tunica externa. Okay? The outer layer. Tunica means coat. So the outer coat, outer layer. The middle layer of both the arteries and the veins, those are smooth muscles. And that is called the tunica media. So M for media, M for muscle. Tunica media. And then the inner layer of both the artery and the vein is called the tunica interna, or intima, tunica intima. So we have the tunica externa, the tunica media, and the tunica intima. So the arteries and veins have the same 3 layers. Now, when we look at it, though, we can see that the arteries are much thicker than the veins, okay? So when we do a cross-section and we cut those arteries and veins, we can see how thick the walls of the arteries are. We can see how thin the walls of the veins are. So the arteries will maintain their shape when they get cut. The veins are going to collapse because they're thin. All right? Okay, now let's take a look at the circuit. So the blood vessels are all in a circuit. They're going to, the arteries leave the heart, they carry blood away from the heart, and then the arteries are going to become capillaries, and then the capillaries become veins, and the veins bring the blood back to the heart. So it's a closed circuit, right? Leaves by arteries, comes back by veins, and it's always just this closed circuit. Right? So there are different sizes of arteries and different sizes of veins. The largest arteries are called the elastic arteries. So those arteries are the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. They're big vessels. So when the heart beats and it pushes that blood up into those big vessels have to be able to receive that blood. And there's a lot of pressure on that, so they're going to have to expand a little bit and then go back to their regular size. They have to be elastic. So that's why we call them the elastic artery. There's a lot of elastic fibers in there that allow them to expand and then come back to their regular size. So those are just the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Then the elastic arteries are going to branch, and when they branch, they're a little bit smaller. And when they branch, they become muscular arteries. Muscular arteries. So the muscular arteries, they have a good amount of smooth muscle in them. Okay. The muscular arteries are the ones that we name. So you're going to hear these names. We've got like the subclavian arteries, the common carotid arteries, the axillary artery, the radial, the ulnar, the femoral. Okay, we're going to hear about all those arteries. We name those. Then the muscular arteries, when they get into the tissues that they're going to branch as well. And they're going to become these smaller arterioles. Now I want you to take a look at the arterioles, because here on the muscular artery, you can see the three layers, right? You can see the tunica externa, the tunica media, the tunica intima, right? Here we look at the arteriole, and there's no tunica externa. So those smooth muscles are exposed, right? They're exposed to the tissues, right? The interstitial tissues. So that means that things like hormones and neurotransmitters can bind to those smooth muscles and cause them to constrict, right? Cause them to contract. And when they contract, the diameter of the blood vessel is going to get smaller, right? So we get vasoconstriction when the arterioles are receiving neurotransmitters or they're receiving hormones that activate those smooth muscles, right? They're going to contract, and we're going to get vasoconstriction. For that reason, we call the arterioles the resistance vessels, right? Because they're the ones that have the most control over, like, your blood pressure, how much resistance there is against the blood flow. Because the vasoconstrict, the blood flow, there's going to be a lot more resistance on blood flow when that narrows down, right? So because of that, now, you're going to get to advanced, and you're going to be talking about the different types of receptors that are on arterioles. So like the alpha-1 receptors. So you're going to hear about these receptors, and it's important to know. They're on the smooth muscles of these blood vessels, of these arterioles. They can't attach here because they can't get through the tunica externa. They can't attach there. They can't get through the tunica externa. It's only on these arterioles where the smooth muscle is exposed, where they can bind and cause contraction. Okay? Now, the arterioles then, they're going to branch, and they're going to become capillaries. And the capillaries, there's two different types of capillaries. There's three different types of capillaries. Okay, we see two here. I'm going to show you another one. We have a continuous capillary, and we have a fenestrated capillary. So let me go to another picture and show you what those capillaries look like. Here you can see them a little bit bigger. There's the continuous ones on one side, and there's the fenestrated ones on the other. If we look at these cells, we can see the capillaries now don't have the tunica externa. They also don't have the tunica media. All they have is the tunica intima. So they're really thin. They are lined by this one layer of simple squamous cells. So things can get in and out of capillaries, right? Where they couldn't get in and out of the arterioles because you had the muscular layer. They couldn't get in and out through the muscular or the elastic arteries because you have both the muscles and the tunica externa. So it's really only the capillaries where you just have the tunica intima, where it's thin enough, where oxygen can leave the blood, carbon dioxide can enter the blood, nutrients can leave the blood, waste products can enter the blood. Does that make sense? It's because it's so thin. So the capillaries are the only place where exchange with the environment occurs. Okay? It's the only place. So let's take a look at the difference between the two. This one is a continuous capillary. Okay, so you're seeing this up here, you're seeing just the simple squamous cells up there, right? Very thin. You're going to find these capillaries everywhere in the body, just about, okay? So there's a few places, a few tissues where there's no blood supply. Like we knew the epithelium is avascular, cartilage is avascular, ligaments are avascular. every other tissue in your body is going to have blood supply. It's going to have these capillaries. So, like I said, the oxygen, the red blood cells are inside the capillary carrying the oxygen. Oxygen can quickly cross over that capillary lining and enter into the tissues. Then we have these capillaries that are called fenestrated capillaries. They're just like the continuous capillaries, only they have these additional fenestrations or holes in the cells. So fenestrated capillaries have holes in the cells. Why would we need holes? To let stuff out even faster, right? So when would we need faster diffusion? Like in endocrine tissues, right? In endocrine organs, when we have a hormone being delivered to a tissue, we need the hormone to leave the blood really quickly so that it can get to that tissue before the blood passes by that tissue. So we're going to find this in endocrine tissues, endocrine organs. Okay? We're also going to find it in the kidney because you know the blood comes into the kidney. The blood has to get filtered really fast. So coming out of these fenestrations and into the tubules of the kidneys, we're going to have water and glucose and sodium and chloride and amino acids and toxins, and all this stuff has to come through these pores and become filtered in the kidney. So we only find fenestrated capillaries in a few places in the body, whereas the continuous were everywhere. The last type of capillary that we see is called the sinusoidal capillary. So the sinusoidal capillary, it's just like the continuous because it only has the one layer. It also has the pores, so it's just like the fenestrated, but in addition to that, it has big gaping holes in between the simple squamous cells. So now we've got big holes in between the cells so that large things can get through them. All right, so where we find this is in the liver. The liver makes plasma proteins, right? When we talked about blood vessels before, we said plasma proteins are inside blood vessels, right? And they're not supposed to get out. They're too large of proteins to get out, so they stay inside the blood vessel. Well, the liver makes them. The liver has to get them into the blood vessel to begin with, right? So the liver makes the plasma proteins. The plasma proteins squeeze into the capillaries through these gaps, through these sinusoids, and now they're in the blood. And once they're in the blood, they're not going to get out, all right? But we just have to be able to get them in the blood after they're made. So that's why we have the sinusoidal capillaries. Okay, so this is what capillaries look like. So you can see here's the arteriole. The arteriole has the smooth muscle around it, and then it becomes a capillary, and the capillary is not going to have the smooth muscle surrounding it. So it just has the simple squamous, the tunica intima, that's it. And we don't have just one capillary coming off the arterioles. We have a whole bunch of capillaries coming off, forming like a capillary bed, right? So it's forming a capillary bed. So here's the arterial end of the capillary. Here is the venous end of the capillary, right? So the blood's flowing through, and it's going to flow through to the vein, and then it's going to go back to the heart, okay? So as it's going through the capillaries, right, it's going to, the hemoglobin will let go of the oxygen, and the oxygen will diffuse into the interstitial space. And as more oxygen does that, the blood starts to become the bluish color, and then it'll converge into a vein, right? So that's just showing you a capillary bed and showing you how, the capillaries then are going to merge together to become a vein, right? Okay, so let's go back and look at the veins then. All right, so here's the veins. Right, here we had the arterioles. The arterioles became the capillary beds. The capillaries, that's where oxygen was delivered to the tissues. And now the capillaries look blue. All the capillaries are going to converge together to to become the smallest vein, which is called a venule. Okay? The smallest vein is called a venule. A bunch of venules are going to merge together to become a medium-sized vein. So it's these medium-sized veins that we name. The jugular vein, the internal jugular, the external jugular, the subclavian, the axillary, the femoral. We name those veins, right? And then all of those veins, they're going to merge together to form a large vein. They're all merging together to form either the inferior vena cava or the superior vena cava. Okay, those are the large veins, and then they drain into the right atrium. Right? Okay, so that's the circuit. Now we have a couple of things that we want to talk about with the veins. So with those medium-sized veins that are named, they have these special structures in them that are called valves. Okay? They look a lot like semilunar valves. And so, when the blood gets pushed out of the heart and it's going through the arteries, there's a pretty good blood flow, right? But then it gets down to the capillaries and it slows down. And now it's got to fight gravity and come all the way back up to the heart. So the pressure is really dropped, right? The pressure's dropped, and we have to get those back up there. It went really slow in the capillary. We got to get them to speed up again and get that blood back to the heart. Well, because the pressure is so much lower in the veins, the blood is going to tend, when the heart's not beating, as soon as the heart relaxes, that blood tends to flow backwards. And we don't want it pooling in the ankles. So the medium-sized veins have these semilunar valves. They have these valves that will close as soon as pressure comes back on them. When the blood's flowing to the heart, the valves are open. As soon as the heart relaxes and the blood tries to flow backwards, those valves are going to close. And it prevents edema around the ankles, right? And then another important part is, where is blood normally found? We normally find the vast majority of blood, the highest percentage of blood at any point in time is going to be found in the veins, right? Not in the arteries. So like 60 to 65% of the blood at any given time will be in the veins. 30 to 35% of the time it's going to be in the arteries. So the veins are really the blood reservoir. And of that, 21% of your blood is going to be in the liver, the bone marrow, and the skin. So those are the organs that are the big blood reservoirs. In the veins, in the liver, the bone marrow, and the skin. 21% of the time we find that blood in those organs. In those veins in those organs. Okay. Okay. So next thing we're going to talk about here so when the blood is coming back to the heart, this picture is showing cardiac output. So we've got hydrostatic pressure pushing the blood out to the capillaries. We get an exchange with the environment, and then the blood starts flowing back through the veins to get back to the heart. And like I said, things really slow down. The pressure at the heart is about when the ventricle contracts, the pressure going out through that aorta, it's about 120 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so the left ventricle contracting, that pressure coming out into that aorta is at 120 millimeters per mercury. Now, when that blood comes down to the capillary, the blood flow decreases a little bit, and then the blood flow starts to pick up and go a little bit faster. but the pressure is still, by the time it gets back up here, because it's fighting gravity and it's fighting resistance and it gets all the way back up, it goes all the way down to 2 millimeters of mercury. Start out at 120, you come back at 2 millimeters of mercury. So we have to think, well, how, it must have some help trying to get that blood back to the heart, right? So there's 3 things really that are going to help getting the blood back. 2 of them are part of your case study. It talked about the pump systems that help with venous return, which means how do we get the veins to bring the blood back to the heart. So the main ones, the first one is called the respiratory pump. The respiratory pump. The respiratory pump is where you have, blood and air are both going to flow from high pressure to low pressure. Since we want the blood to go towards the heart, we would want the pressure in the chest cavity to be lower than the pressure in the legs and the arms, because then the blood would flow towards the lower pressure. It's just kind of a physics thing, everything flows towards the least resistance. It's going to go towards less pressure. So to lower the pressure in the thoracic cavity, when your diaphragm contracts, it expands the size of your thoracic cavity. And so it goes from here, where there's a lot of pressure, and then it gets bigger, where there's now less pressure because there's more room. So all of those molecules in your lungs and in the thoracic cavity there, they have more room to roam around in, so there is less pressure. Do you guys understand why there would be less pressure? Okay? So the pressure in the legs hasn't changed, but it's going to move towards the lower pressure. So every time your diaphragm contracts and you breathe in and the pressure is lower, that blood kind of gets pumped towards the lower pressure. That's the respiratory pump. That's what's going to pull the blood up towards the thoracic cavity. Okay? Then the other pump is called the skeletal muscle pump. Skeletal muscle pump is when you're just moving around and your skeletal muscles are squeezing on those veins. That's going to push the blood towards the heart. The squeezing of the skeletal muscles on those veins is going to push the blood towards the heart. So those are 2 different pumps, skeletal muscle pump and respiratory pump, right? It's all about the blood moving towards the lower pressure. Skeletal muscles are squeezing, that's too much pressure, blood's going to move towards the heart. Increase the thoracic cavity, that's less pressure, blood's going to be kind of sucked up towards the heart, pulled up towards the heart. Okay, so that's how we get the blood. We help to get the blood back. There's also, and we can't forget about the peripheral veins. They also have smooth muscle in them. So they're going to do some amount of contracting themselves. They'll be vasoconstricting a little bit, and that'll help to bring the blood back too. So it's really those 3 things, but the 2 pumps that were talked about in the case study were respiratory and skeletal muscle pumps. Okay, then what we want to do is talk about a little bit of physiology. Okay, a little bit of physiology. And with physiology, one of the things we talk about is blood flow. Blood flow is how fast is the blood moving through a vessel. All right, so what would give the blood its speed to begin with? From what? The heart, right? So when the heart beats and the blood gets pushed out, what kind of pressure do we call that? It's water, so it's hydrostatic pressure. So when the heart beats and the water pushes out, that's hydrostatic pressure. That tells you that's how fast the blood will move if there's no resistance against it at all. But the other thing is we have some things that resist it. So in other words, here's the heart, here's the aorta, right? The heart squeezes and the blood pushes out. That is hydrostatic pressure. That's going to push the blood out, it's going to push it forward, all right? But then we have some things out here that are going to push back, and that is called resistance. So the two forces that are going to control blood flow are hydrostatic pressure, which pushes the blood forward, right? Pushes the blood forward, and then resistance, which pushes back on that blood flow. So to get the total blood flow, we would have to subtract the two, right? We'd have to subtract two. So let's talk about some of the things that cause resistance on the blood vessel, okay, that cause resistance in this system. What pushes back on the blood flow? Well, first of all, we have what's called vascular resistance. Vascular resistance. So this is the resistance that the blood vessel itself has on blood flow. So we're looking at the vessels. That's what we mean. We're looking at the vessels. What does the vessel, how does the vessel itself slow down, or how does it affect blood flow? And when we're looking at it, we look at two things. We look at the length of the blood vessel, and we look at the diameter of the blood vessel. Okay, the length and the diameter. Well, so we know about length. The shorter the length of a vessel, the less resistance there is. The longer the length, the greater the resistance. Okay? So if you take a blood vessel and you double its length, you're going to double its resistance. So let's think about this. If you have a snorkel and you're going to blow water out of that snorkel, is it that tough to do? No. If you take a garden hose and you try to blow water out of a garden hose, is that going to be tough? Yeah. So what's causing the resistance? It's the water against the sides of the hose. Same thing in the blood vessels. When the blood's flowing through the blood vessels, it's hitting the sides of the blood vessels, and that's slowing it down, right? Okay? All right, so that is the length. Now, the diameter has even greater effect on resistance. If you take the diameter of a blood vessel and you decrease it by 1/2, you're going to increase the resistance up to like 16 or 17 times. Right? So when is that going to be an issue? Yep, there you go. So when you have plaquing, right? So here's a blood vessel here. And you can see all this plaquing in here. So this is the only open lumen that there is. That's going to create a lot of resistance on blood flow. That's going to really slow down the amount of blood that's getting to your tissues and the amount of blood that's coming back to your heart. Now your heart's going to have to work harder, right? Because that resistance is really slowing down that blood flow. So now that heart has to work really hard. This is an actual picture that we see then of plaque deposit in a vessel wall. And again, if you take the diameter and you in half, if you cut it in half, there's the plaquing, cut it in half, that's going to increase resistance like 16 to 17 times. So diameter has a much, much bigger impact than length does on resistance. Okay. The next thing that we have, other than vascular, is we have viscosity of blood. Viscosity. Okay, blood is already thicker than water, right? It's already thicker than water. But if a person is really dehydrated and they don't have as much extracellular fluid, they don't have as much plasma, right? Then the blood's going to be even thicker, right? So it's going to move slower. So the higher the viscosity, the thicker the blood is, the more the resistance, the more it's going to slow down the blood flow. Okay. And then the third thing that we have, where did that picture go? The third thing that we have is called turbulence. Turbulence. So what's turbulence? You know, when water is flowing down, you know, the river and it hits some rocks and it starts, you know, ebbing and flowing like that, that's turbulence, right? So there's going to be some blood vessels where we expect to have turbulence. The aorta and the pulmonary trunk, because of the pressure of the ventricles, you're going to get some turbulence in there. That's normal. That's okay. Those vessels can handle it. They're elastic, right? They're elastic. They can handle that turbulence. When we get plaquing, now you've got like rocks in the river. As soon as that blood hits it, it's going to start becoming turbulent, and that's going to slow down the blood flow, right? So that's another reason why that plaquing is so important. Not only does it decrease the diameter, but it's also causing a turbulence that slows down the blood flow. Okay? So whenever we're looking at blood flow, we have those two things. We have the hydrostatic pressure that's pushing the flow, and then we have the resistance that's pushing it back on it, okay? Okay, so that's that. Let's see. Then, you know, we're not going to get too much farther into the, into the physiology. A couple of things that I have to tell you before I get into this. This is the last of the physiology, and then we're going to actually talk about blood vessels, okay? We can measure blood pressure. So we can measure like the peak arterial pressure and the minimal arterial pressure by putting that sphygmometer, around a blood pressure cuff and measuring that. And so there's two numbers that we always look at. The first one here is like 120 is normal. And the second one, they used to say 80. I think they're down to 70 now, they say is normal. Oh, now it's 130 over 70. Okay. Okay, so it's like 170 over 30, 130 over 70. The 130 number, that is the systolic pressure, okay? And the 70, that is the diastolic pressure, okay? So we know what systolic pressure, we know what systolic means, right? What's it mean? When the heart contracts, right? So when the heart's contracting, at the peak of the arterial pressure, at the peak number, that's going to be your systolic, okay? So that's the systolic, and then diastolic, that's going to be when the ventricles are relaxed at the minimum arterial pressure, when the ventricles are relaxed, okay? So anything above that is an indication that the heart is having some issues. Anything below it as well. Low blood pressure is not any better, it's also not good, okay? But, yeah, I knew they changed it. I just didn't know what.
So if the diastolic number is high, does that mean they're not resting as long?
That means that there's a lot of peripheral resistance, yeah, and they can't rest. Because during the resting stage, they should be able to just rest, and there shouldn't be a lot of resistance against the walls of the blood vessel. So somewhere there's resistance.
How do you reverse that?
Well, it's going to be from, we have to look at what's causing the resistance. So maybe they're going to give aspirin, because that'll help with the viscosity. They're going to talk about diet because they want to get rid of or they're going to give you a statin drug to help get rid of some of the plaquing. So they have to do something to get rid of the resistance, to lower the resistance. Yep, it's all due to resistance, absolutely. Okay, all right, so then the last thing that we're going to look at, and then I'm going to show you some blood vessels here. This is our capillary here, right here. And I'm going to keep this really simple for this class because we're going to go into this more in advance. Here's the arterial. So this is bringing blood to the capillary. Here's the venule. So the blood is flowing into the venule, right? So when we look at this end of the capillary, we just say that's the arterial end of the capillary because it's close to the artery. This end over here, this is the venous end of the capillary. Okay? So and the capillary is the only place where we have exchange of anything with the environment. And so what I'm going to talk about now is fluid, the movement of fluid, right? So again, water can only move in and out in a capillary. It can't do it in the arterioles, it can't do it in the venules, it can't do it anywhere else. It can only be in the capillary. So we have different forces that are going to move fluid. And the first force that we already talked about was called hydrostatic pressure. So hydrostatic pressure is it's from the heartbeat, and it's going to push blood into the capillary and against the capillary walls where we have thin, there's some aquaporins actually, there's these little holes that water can go through, and the water is going to be pushed against the side and go through those pores into the interstitial fluid, right? So where do you think the hydrostatic pressure is going to be greater? At the arterial end or at the venous end? At the arterial end, right? By the time it gets down there, the blood's slowed down so much, the hydrostatic pressure is going to be a lot less, right? So we do have more pressure here. We have 35 millimeters of mercury on this end versus 18 millimeters of mercury on the venous end, right? So we do have more of this hydrostatic pressure. And when hydrostatic pressure is pushing fluid and other solutes out, we call that filtration. Okay, so that's filtration. Right, then we have another pressure, and that other pressure is caused by colloid osmotic pressure. Colloid means proteins, and then we've got osmotic pressure. So where did we say we find proteins? In the blood. So in the blood here is a lot of proteins, right? We've got these plasma proteins. Albumins, like we said, make up 60 to 65% of the plasma proteins. And they are the ones that they help to create the osmotic pressure. So what are those proteins going to do in regards to water? Well, the proteins can't get out of the blood, so what's going to happen with water? So the water is going to move into the vessel, right? So now we had, and that, when water's drawn back into the capillary, that's called reabsorption. Okay, reabsorption. So we have these two forces. We have hydrostatic pressure pushing water out, that's called filtration, and we have colloid osmotic pressure pulling fluid in, and that's called reabsorption.
They happen like they overlap?
They overlap. So in the end, we end up with one number because we subtract the two. How much is being pushed out versus how much is coming back in, subtract the two, and we get a net filtration pressure. So we talk about that. And so that's all I really want you to know for now. Just the terms, filtration, pushes fluid into the interstitial fluid, right? From the capillary into the interstitial fluid. It's caused by the hydrostatic pressure. Reabsorption brings fluid back into the capillary from the interstitial fluid, and that's caused by colloid proteins. So we call that the colloid osmotic pressure. So that's, that just in general, that's going to help you once we move on to advanced. Now, let me ask you something. Let me put this into your head, right? So if you have a person with high blood pressure, are they going to have a higher or lower hydrostatic pressure? Are they going to have higher or lower filtration? They're going to have higher filtration, right? Higher hydrostatic pressure, higher filtration. We're going to get fluid being pushed out into the interstitial fluid. Would that have anything to do with them having like swollen ankles? Yeah, because that fluid's being pushed out into the extracellular fluid, right, into the interstitial fluids, and pooling there, right? Because it's being pushed out faster, but it's not being reabsorbed faster, right? Okay, so it pools. Then let's look at someone that is, say, they have an eating disorder, and they're anorexic. They're not eating enough food. They're not getting enough proteins or nutrients. So their levels of proteins are going to be decreased. Their levels of plasma proteins are going to be decreased. What's that going to do to the fluid level in the capillaries? You don't have as much proteins in here, right? So you're not going to have as much reabsorption.
Gonna decrease it.
Right, so you're getting water being pushed out, but not coming back in. So there could be, that also, they're gonna have some edema and swelling and, a little dehydration, right? Because their blood is not gonna have the amount of fluid that it should have. Okay? All right, so there's just showing someone with their, the compression stockings on to try to, push that fluid back into the lymphatic system because it's coming out of the capillaries and it's pooling in the interstitial fluid. So those stockings help to push it into another system, which we're going to talk about next Wednesday, called the lymphatic system, that'll help to bring it back to the heart. Because the veins aren't bringing it back to the heart, so we got to put it in the lymphatic system to bring it back to the heart, right? Okay, so now we're going to go over some blood vessels. First lab, you're going to hear this again because I've already gone over this, but it's never a bad idea to hear something more than once, right? We're going to look at the different arteries and veins that are in your lab list. Okay. So we're going to start with the pulmonary circuit. Chapter 21, pulmonary circuit. Okay. We have, so here's the heart. When we're talking about the pulmonary circuit, it's not going to be on any of the larger models. I'm really going to have it either on the heart, probably the heart. That's where you're going to see the majority of the vessels. The right side of the heart here pumps blood out through the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk then divides into the left pulmonary artery that goes to the left lung and the right pulmonary artery that goes to the right lung. So you can see those really well on our heart model. You can see them really good on the heart model. Then when blood comes back, it's going to come back to the left atrium. We can see the two right pulmonary veins right here and the two left pulmonary veins right here. And what did we notice? The arteries are blue and the veins are red, exactly opposite of what all the rest of them are going to be. All right, so just keep that in mind. If it has the name pulmonary in it, it's going to be exact opposite. Arteries will be blue, veins will be red. Okay, so that's our pulmonary circuit then. Then we look at the systemic circuit, and the systemic circuit is the aorta delivering the body to the rest of, delivering the blood to the rest of your body, right? So blood is getting pumped out of the left ventricle into this aorta. Now this aorta is an extremely long vessel, right? It goes all the way down to the pelvic cavity. So if we see this is the first part of the aorta, blood is going up, so we call it the ascending aorta. Then it loops around, so that's the arch of the aorta. And then it comes all the way down, so then that's the descending aorta. Now the descending aorta is very long, so we divide that into two parts. Here's that diaphragm. Remember that muscle? The aorta, the descending aorta that's above that, that's going to be called your thoracic aorta. It sits behind the heart. You can't really see it from here to here. And then the abdominal aorta is below the diaphragm all the way down to the pelvic cavity. Okay. So you'll see, I'm not going to have you just say aorta. I'm going to have you either say thoracic aorta or abdominal aorta, if I put the stickers on there. Thoracic or abdominal aorta. Now we're going to look at the branches that come off of the aorta. And the first branches that come off are on the arch of the aorta. And there are 3 three branches that come off of the arch. On the right side, starting on the right side, we have the brachiocephalic trunk. Okay? The brachiocephalic trunk is going to go to the right side of the body. It's going to branch off and supply the right side of the head and brain and supply the right arm with blood, right? So the brachiocephalic trunk branches into the right common carotid, which goes up your neck, supplies the head and brain, and it branches into the right subclavian, and the right subclavian is going to go down your arm. Right? So that comes off of the brachiocephalic trunk. Now going to the left side, we have more on the arch. There's enough room on the arch of the aorta. So the left common carotid comes right off of the aorta, and the left subclavian comes right off of the aorta. Those two, they do not have to form, there's not a trunk that divides to form those two. They come directly off of the aorta. Okay? Then the left common carotid is going to go up, and it's going to supply your head and your brain, and the subclavian is going to go down your arm. Yep.
Do we need to know left and right, even though it's not on?
Yes. So you do have to know, and when we get to lab, I'll show you on the lab list, there's like 6 blood vessels in chapter 21 that you do not have to say right or left because there's only one, right? All the rest of them, you have to say right or left. So if it's going to the right side of the body, if it's going to your right leg, your right arm, you're going to say right artery or right vein. If it's going to the left side of the body, the left arm, the left leg, you're going to say it's the left artery or the left vein. You do have to put right or left down or you will get it wrong.
When it branches off, do we have like somewhere there capillaries?
So the capillaries, these are just, so what we're seeing here are just all of those muscular arteries. So the muscular arteries, then they're going to branch into arterioles, and then the arterioles are going to branch into the capillaries. So all we're seeing here are the muscular arteries. We're not seeing any arterioles because we don't name arterioles anyway. We're not seeing any capillaries. But yes, that will happen. They'll all branch, smaller and smaller and smaller down to those capillaries. Yep. Okay? All right, so now let's talk about the subclavian arteries. The right and the left subclavian artery. So the right subclavian artery goes under the clavicle and becomes the right axillary artery. Same vessel, just changes names because it's in a different area. The right axillary artery becomes the right brachial artery in the brachium, in the arm. Okay? And then the brachial artery gets to the elbow, and then it divides. And it becomes the ulnar artery on the pinky side, so on the medial side, and the radial artery on the thumb side. Okay? It's going to be the same exact way on the left side of the body. Subclavian to axillary to brachial to radial and ulnar arteries. Exactly the same. The only difference between the right and the left side is that the common carotid and the subclavian on the right came off of the brachiocephalic trunk, where the common carotid and the subclavian on the left came directly off the arch of the aorta. It's the only difference between the right and the left side. Okay. Then the next branches that we see are going to, that are on your list, are going to be on the abdominal aorta. And the two branches, the two arteries that branch off of it that you need to know the superior mesenteric artery. So here you can see it and it's cut. So in this diagram it was cut off, the superior mesenteric artery. The superior mesenteric artery is actually quite long, and after it comes off of the abdominal aorta, it's going to go, here we can see it in the entire length of it. It's right here. It comes off the abdominal aorta, it's going to go down and branch off, and it's going to supply the intestines on the right side of your abdominal cavity. It's going to give oxygen to all that intestinal area on the right. So that is the superior mesenteric artery. There's only one, so you don't have to say right or left. Okay? So if we saw that diagram, you would see the whole thing. If you see it on a model, you're going to see it cut off like this. It's just going to be cut because they can't carry it. There's no, on those models, there's no intestines. So it's not going to go all the way to the intestines. Also on the abdominal aorta, we have the renal arteries, right? So here's the renal artery. So there's the kidneys, another name for kidney is renal. So we have the right renal artery and the left renal artery. And then when we get down to the pelvic cavity, the abdominal aorta divides, and it divides into the common iliac arteries. So we have the right common iliac and the left common iliac. The next blood vessel that we need to know on our lab list is when that vessel is going to pierce through the inguinal ligaments. And as soon as it does that, it becomes the femoral artery, or the femoral artery. Okay, so we got the femoral artery. Okay, so here's the leg. You can see the femoral artery just underneath that inguinal ligament. And then the femoral artery is going to come all the way down, go right behind the knee, and then it's going to divide. And one of the branches is going to come around to the front and go on the front of the tibia, and that is called the anterior tibial artery. And one of the branches is going to go behind the tibia, and that's called the posterior tibial artery. So in the leg, we just have the femoral and then the anterior and posterior tibial arteries. Okay, I'll tell you one of the diagrams I like. I like this diagram here. There's going to be a lot of diagrams on the exam. I don't want to fool you. We have models, but I also use a lot of diagrams. So here, since this person is turned this way, we're seeing the right side of their neck. This is the brachiocephalic trunk. This is the right common carotid. This is the right subclavian. So it's under the clavicle. It becomes the right axillary artery. So I'm not going to ask you on the exam, name the artery, name the vein. I'm going to say, name the blood vessel. You'll have to say right subclavian artery. Right axillary artery. Okay. All right, so those are the arteries. Now we're going to talk about the veins. And the veins, go back here real quick. And then we're done. So I'm just going to push through and finish up. So here's the veins. Now, the veins, of course, are returning blood to the right atrium. So they're going to return it through the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. So first what we'll do is we'll talk about all the blood vessels that we need to know from our lab list that drain blood into the superior vena cava, right? So superior vena cava, there's two major blood vessels called the brachiocephalic veins. So there's a right brachiocephalic vein and there's a left brachiocephalic vein. Here's the right, here's the left. They merge together to form the superior vena cava. We no longer have the brachiocephalic veins on the lab list. So, used to have it, but it's not. But it's important for you to see them. And now I'm going to show you a bigger picture so you can see the brachiocephalic vein and you can see the veins that are draining into that. So this picture I love to have on the exam. Okay, so on here, this is that, here's the right brachiocephalic vein, here's the left brachiocephalic vein. Now, so you remember in the arteries, there was only one brachiocephalic trunk, that was an artery. Okay, but these are two brachiocephalic veins. So coming into the brachiocephalic vein are several veins. Several veins are draining into that, so the blood will drain into the superior vena cava and drain into the right atrium. We have these blood vessels, and if you look at them close to where they're coming into the brachiocephalic, you can come up with an acronym. to remember them. So the first one here is called the internal jugular vein. So that's going to go up into the foramen magnum and supply your brain with blood. That's the internal jugular vein. The middle one here that comes off in the middle, this one's going to go up through those transverse foramen of the cervical spine. That's going to go then in through the foramen magnum and supply your brain with blood. I'm so sorry, not supply, drain your brain. So the internal jugular is draining the blood from the brain. The vertebral vein is draining the blood from your brain. Right? That's what veins do. They drain blood. Okay? Veins drain blood. They're not supplying blood to anything. They're draining blood. And then we have this one, which is called the external jugular. So it's draining blood from the outside of your head, right? So that's one right here. This is the external jugular vein. Okay? And then we have this one here, and this one's called the subclavian vein. Okay? So when we look at all four of these veins that are draining into this brachiocephalic vein, we can take the first letter of each word, I for internal, V for vertebral, E for external, S for subclavian. That spells Ives, right? Ives, Ives, I-V-E-S. I-V-E-S. Internal jugular, vertebral, external jugular, subclavian. Okay, and those are all the right internal jugular vein, right vertebral vein, right external jugular vein, right subclavian vein. Okay, now let's see what happens to that subclavian vein, right? So up at the top here, this is going to look a little different than the artery does. The subclavian vein, here's the subclavian vein, okay? When it gets to the axillary area, it's going to divide. And the axillary vein is going to be the vein that's more lateral. The axillary vein is going to go down to the elbow, okay? So that's the axillary vein. Now if we look on the other branch, okay, the other branch, we don't have to name that. That vein is going to come down and it's going to divide as well. And when it divides, the vein that goes down the middle of the arm, that's called your brachial vein. That's your brachial vein, right? So the brachial vein goes all the way down past the elbow and divides into the ulnar vein and the radial vein, right? So we have to know the subclavian and the axillary and the brachial vein. And then the other vein that we have to know is the median cubital vein. And that's a vein that runs diagonally across the inside of the elbow. Okay? And it connects to two branches that we did not have to name. So we've got the median cubital vein. That vein is where we do most venipunctures to draw blood from. Okay? Did you have a question, Ali?
I was just making sure. You said which one was the axillary?
So this one is the axillary.
No, what? The other one.
Did I say, which one did I say?
You said the other one was, it's cephalic. The other one's cephalic.
Oh, I said this one was? Oh, I'm sorry. No, this one is the axillary. I'm sorry about that. The axillary, and the axillary divides into the brachial vein and then the basilic vein, which we don't have on our list, but then we have the median cubital vein. Sorry about that. Okay, so we have subclavian, axillary, brachial, ulnar, and radial. Okay, and then you have the median cubital. Right? Okay. All right. So then, this is just showing a bigger picture. Here's the brachial coming down and dividing into the ulnar and the radial. If we look at the rest of the inferior vena cava, there's a couple that you have to know. coming off of the inferior vena cava, we have the two renal veins. So we have the left renal vein and the right renal vein. Then the inferior vena cava comes down to the pelvic cavity and divides. It splits into the common iliac. So we have the right common iliac and the left common iliac. And then as the blood vessel goes through the inguinal canal or the inguinal ligament, then it becomes the femoral. So now let's look at what happens to the femoral vein in the leg. Okay, so here's the leg. Here's the femoral vein. The femoral vein is going to travel down to the knee, and it's going to divide into the anterior tibial. It'll go around to the front. That's the anterior tibial. And then the posterior tibial, which will remain on the back of the tibia. Okay, so you get the anterior and posterior tibial. One of the other branches that comes off of the femoral is way up high in the thigh, and that branch is going to go down the inside of the thigh all the way down to the ankle, and that is called the great saphenous vein. The great saphenous vein. Okay, then there's just one last vein that you need to know about, and this one I didn't include anywhere else because it really doesn't connect with the systemic circuit at all. It's a vein, it's a portal vein that goes from the intestines to the liver. That's it. It's called the superior mesenteric vein. So we would see this picture, it wouldn't be on any model. It's going from the intestines, and then it's traveling up, it's joining another vein, and it's going into the liver. So why do we need that? It's not connecting to the inferior vena cava, it's not connecting to any systemic art or vein, it's just going from the intestines to the liver. Because when you eat, and all the nutrients are being absorbed from your intestines, they get absorbed into the blood, and they get absorbed into the superior mesenteric, as well as the inferior mesenteric veins. And they join together and take those nutrients to the liver. So the liver has the first pass. The liver can decide what to do with that, right? So even if it's medication, even if it's drugs, those are going to go to the liver first. And they might get metabolized and broken down. That's called first pass, right? So even nutrients do that. The liver has to decide, what do I do with those nutrients then? Do I store it? Do I store glucose as glycogen? Do I send it out into the circulation? If it decides to send it out into the circulation, it's going to go through the hepatic vein from the liver to the inferior vena cava. And that's how the blood will get back into the systemic circuit.
So it will have to be oxygenated before it goes to with the glucose?
Yeah, so the superior mesenteric artery will deliver oxygen to the intestines, but then the superior mesenteric vein will pick up nutrients and bring it to the liver.
But if the liver decides I'm going to send glucose to the blood,
Yes.
does it puts in the superior vena cava? Or?
Yep, it does. So if the liver says, okay, I'm not going to store that as glycogen, instead I want to put it out into general circulation, it'll have this hepatic vein right here, deliver it to the inferior vena cava.
So it will go to the heart, to the lungs, and then to the body.
Yep.
Okay.
But so and some of the nutrients will get delivered to the lungs because the lungs need it too. And so along the way, you'll just have more, nutrients being dispersed throughout the body. Yep, exactly. All right. So any questions? Okay, then I'm going to give you guys 10 minutes before we start lab. I'll open it up now. We have to go over the Chapter 20 case studies, and then we have to go over look at the models. And that's it for today. Okay? Yeah.